Hello everybody, I'm Stephen Bauman, and in this video, I'm going to show you two different ways that you can simplify your portrait drawings. Right off the top, I want to tell you, simplifying your portrait drawings is important because you need at those initial stages of the drawing to get to a place where you have a tangible sense of accuracy when it comes to proportion. And we can't do that without having something on the paper. The path that you choose to take at this early stage can be determined by a couple of different factors. What we're really talking about is how do you see the model? By the way, before we get into the demo, you should know all of this stuff is covered extensively on my Patreon page, both in the Atelier tier lessons, but also in the Block-In Bootcamp live sessions that I have with my Patreon subscribers. You can follow the link in the description of this video to get to the web page, get subscribed, and start learning. But anyway, on to the demo. The first style of simplification that I'm going to show you is a visual style of simplification. Now this means we're going to focus on a really polarized dark and light pattern. It's going to help us get to a place where we have the right kinds of shapes to create an accurate vision of this model. You can see that the initial block in itself is going to be a really rough one. All I want to do right now is just get a couple things on the paper that are more or less in the shape of a head or in the shape of this pose, which I can make a couple of measurements from before I add in the visual shapes that are really going to help me take this to another level. I think a lot of times students will get caught up trying to make the initial lines on their paper really perfect and really beautiful. I can say that as a professional, that's not something I'm really hung up about. We can go ahead and add a little bit of a center line to the head, maybe a slight indication of where we think the brow and the nose will be, and a little bit the placement of the ear. Now let's assess. Are we perfect? Far from it. We've got a long way to go in terms of making this actually look like a model, but what we do have is a decent set of proportions that I've measured from top to bottom, from left to right. I've compared some of the angles in relationship to each other. I've looked at the height of the brow ridge in relationship to the height of other parts of the features. And I have something that, if you were generous, you would say, looks like a human head. This is where we stop this part of the process and move on to what we're actually here for. A visual simplification. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about doing that. The way that I like to do it is to actually start with a coherent outline of the large masses of value everywhere before filling them in. Now, what are my expectations here? I don't expect that I'm going to be correct about all of the lines that I'm putting in. I would like them to be relatively in the right place, but my goal really is to give myself a set of shapes that I can then take and make accurate by utilizing my visual memory and my ability to measure. The trick is you can't really use either of those capacities to make something accurate if you don't have something on the paper. And so what we want to do is get the simplest possible thing on the paper that we can that will allow us to engage with both mechanical measurements and also our innate intuitive ability to recognize differences in between the drawing and the subject. Now, if you're asking yourself while doing this, how do I create these simplifications? How do I know where to put the lines and where to put the shapes? The simple answer is squint down and look at your subject. By reducing the amount of light that gets into your eye, you're reducing the degree of contrast in between the darker areas of the drawing. What this does is gives you a more polarized view of the subject, meaning that things tend to look dark or they tend to look light. And those, of course, are the two groups of value that we're using to create our visual simplification of this subject. Now with my paper stump, I'm going to go ahead and just even out a little bit the value inside of these shapes. Quick tip for all you out there using your paper stumps in your drawings. The trick is don't overdo it. If you over stump, you're going to get a really awkward appearance to your drawing. It's going to look, in a way, too smooth, too early, which I find is not ideal for developing a full value drawing. Let's go ahead and make a quick comparison here between this and the subject. Squint down with me. See the way that the light shapes are popping out from the drawing. This is because we've essentially unified all of the dark shapes surrounding them. Because we don't have any excess value inside of this, the polarized impression of the two is relatively similar enough that we can start to look at the character and size of the light shapes here, and through that comparison, triangulate and discover what shapes line up where and how we can use that kind of triangulation to create an accurate set of proportions that later will allow us to make a drawing that really gets very close to what our subject looks like. I'm going to take this moment now and push this drawing forward just a little bit so we get an idea of where it's going. Now let's make a quick distinction. The shapes that I'm drawing here are not exactly shadow shapes. Really, I'm just looking at the source image and trying to use what I find to be a dark value or a light value. I know that this seems like I'm splitting hairs, but the reality is those are two different kinds of phenomenon, and there'll be plenty of moments where you actually need to make a distinction in between those two things. Now, a couple signs that you might be doing this the wrong way is if you have any value inside the light shape, or if you have really complex shapes going on inside the features. Remember that your goal is to get the simplest possible expression of the subject onto the paper. Ultimately, anything else is something of a distraction from what we're trying to accomplish. This kind of block-in drawing is really defined as much by what you leave out as what you include. The baseline for making any kind of simplification is that you need to be an editor. You need to take things away rather than simply including everything. It's actually one of the ways in which, even as a beginner, you can exercise your artistic vision. Because after all, creating an artwork is a lot about selecting the kind of information you want to emphasize and removing the things that you think take away from you expressing your vision. This is where I'm going to stop today. And you can see that while it's a really rough and cool and pretty effective way to simplify, there are some things that are actually not so cool about it. One of them is, look at all of this space within this light shape. It's totally disconnected. There's a lot of structure inside there that we're missing, that we're actually not using to help us create an impression of a structurally symmetrical face. This, for me, ultimately was a problem. This is the way I was trained when I was a student at the academy, and I think I really rode this method for all it was worth. But ultimately, I needed to move on to another kind of simplification to enrich this process, and that is the structural style of simplification. And let's get into that now. Now, I'm going to borrow these proportions here and make another study that's just about exactly the same size. The difference in between the two is that here, I'm going to use a head structure template to simplify this pose. Now, there are a lot of different head structure templates out there. The one that I use is essentially a combination in between several different kinds of templates. Probably the most famous of these is the one developed by Loomis. And what we're trying to do essentially is make a three-dimensional wireframe that represents well the structure of the subject. Once again, I'm doing a really fast, rough, and loose block-in, which would be pretty much in keeping with how I'd work in my own studio. A lot of times in my demonstrations for teaching, I'll make really pristine versions of these block-ins just because I'm trying to show what the ideal example of a block-in would look like. But here, between us, we're going to be fast, loose, and rough because we can afford to be. Because sometimes that's what drawing needs, actually. I don't think drawings always need to be perfectly smooth. Now, what's the idea here and what's the difference? The idea is that I'm using a generic three-dimensional conception of the head that really has actually little to do with what this subject looks like on the surface. Hence, this being visual, this being structural. My focus here is the planes of any head, not specifically the planes of this model's head. In time, of course, I'm going to make those two meet each other in the middle, and what we're going to have is a great simplification that we can make eventually look like this model. You can see, of course, that there are a lot of similarities. I'm using a lot of straight lines to design this block-in, and definitely my goal is essentially the same, that I want a very simple expression of the model that I'm working with. But here I'm using a totally different means to get there. And you can see what I'm essentially focused on is finding a high degree of structural symmetry. Whatever I find on one side of the model, I want to try and find on the other side of the model. In this way, we can establish the basic geometry of the head, and then we can use that three-dimensional looking, structurally symmetrical template to add our model's features to. Also going to add the nose here as this projecting plane that comes out from the face. It's another moment where you're going to see how different these two different kinds of models are in the way that they ultimately express the subject. Now, a couple things about this process that are going to be useful to know. One, it's approximate. I don't actually know where the top of her skull is, but that's what I'm intending to show with these planes. I don't know where the back of her skull is, but that's also what I'm attempting to show with this approximate vision that I'm blocking in. In my experience, learning to draw in this way actually takes a little bit longer and I think is, in fact, a little bit harder than learning to draw this way. But that's only because everything you need to know about this one is actually right in front of your face. This one involves learning the ins and outs of the use of a particular kind of simplification or template, or even more challenging, to develop one of your own. I think over the years, eventually, artists that draw this way always develop their own particular kind of simplification. So there are only a few that really exist all on their own. The one I keep bringing up is Loomis, but you could also look at the Riley method. Though if I'm honest, I don't use that one and I have never really particularly liked it. Other people have a lot of experience with it and a lot of success with it, so by no means is it bad. It's just about taste, and mine leads me to another place. What we want to do at this point is actually make sure that our template fits this model's head, meaning what is the width of the forehead between this section here, the temporal line, and the temporal line on the other side, the width between the cheekbones, the length of the nose, the length of the space between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin. And by the way, of course, I haven't even placed the mouth yet. Let's say that it's somewhere here. I'm gonna go ahead and make some corrections and see where I get to. While I'm doing this, I want to mention something I think is really important. There's a lot of anxiety around block-in and needing to be perfect when you're blocking in. For me, I care very little about how specifically accurate my initial block-in is. What I'm looking for is something that I can easily correct. It's my feeling that if you have a drawing that is designed really well at its early stage, it should be easy to make changes and corrections. I don't expect that the first marks I put on the paper are going to be objectively accurate. I feel like that kind of pressure would be way too much. Now, I'm sure to some of you, this looks all very abstract and a little bit crazy, and probably nothing like the subject. But here's what I have to say about it. If you know the points that you're searching for and how they lie along a symmetrical central axis, a block-in like this can make a ton of sense and also can make a dramatic impact on how you're able to block in the shadow and light once you get to this place. The power of this template and templates like this one really comes with lots of practice. Like I said, I think learning to draw in this way creates a faster result. I think that learning to draw both of these ways creates eventually a deeper result. In making work for myself, I think I'm always looking for a way to understand more, to know more about the subject. So these two are one of many different ways that I try and look at my subjects and decipher them so that when I make a drawing where I want to really show or express something, I have all these tools at my disposal that will help me to say exactly what I'm trying to say with that artwork. The last thing I want to say about this one is this is essentially the first stop along the line to making a really great structural block-in. There's so much more interesting stuff that we can add and really interesting stuff that we can explore in terms of creating a great deal of depth and understanding of the three-dimensional sense of this subject. Practicing this as a baseline is a great way to get faster, get better, and contribute more to your visual simplification as well. Let's also take a really quick moment here and watch how this drawing can be turned into a realistic portrait, because I know that this planes of the head, of course, can be really intimidating in how abstract it looks. The reality is, once you know how to create this basic model for the head, it's relatively easy to attach the features, light and shadow, halftone and modeling, and eventually come to a realistic portrait drawing at the end. Either of these simplifications are a good start on the way to a finished drawing. The reason I'm choosing to take the structural head further is because I think it is the one that students have a more difficult time assimilating and understanding how it fits into their drawing process. Okay, now that you've watched me make two distinct and different types of simplifications for a portrait, I would imagine that you want to do some practice yourself. If you follow the second link in the description of this video, it will take you to a free post on my Patreon page where you can download a model pack with images of this model. Those source images are taken with a very specific kind of primary dominant light source that is helpful for visualizing this particular kind of approach to simplification. And of course, if you want to learn more about portrait drawing and portrait painting, my Patreon page has just about every kind of lesson you could look for. Anyway, thank you everybody so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. I'm Stephen Bauman, and I'll see you in the next one.